Okay, we're here at Dr. Martin Luther King Day, and this is Stephen G. Ezrati. I think you might be able to figure out, what his lineage is as an association with David. I read your book, today, My Son, and you were just talking a minute ago about William Garrison. And as soon as you said that, I reflected back to the part of your book that talked about all they teach in history is names and dates and
right.
No contextual relationship. So who was William Garrison in the context of where you... I know I jumped right into it, but...
Okay. William Garrison published a newspaper in Boston, which was the abolitionist flagship newspaper. And his office or establishment was right across the street from where I went to school. And they never mentioned him. They never told us about it.
Did you go to school with any, what was the prevailing term of the day? Was it Negroes or African Americans?
No, African Americans wasn't even invented.
Yes, I know.
It was Negroes. And we didn't normally even use that. We used colored.
Colored, okay. Were there any colored people in your school?
Oh, God, yes.
And what year was this?
1942 to 1945.
Okay, during the...
It was the class that didn't graduate.
The class that didn't graduate?
Yes, they held a graduation ceremony for us, but most of us were in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, and hardly anybody showed up. And we had class officers and so forth, which we had elected, whom we had elected. And many, many years later, I wrote an article for the Boston Herald, whatever happened to the class of 1945. And so we had our first reunion. Ah,
so you never had a reunion. Now, wait a second. And also, we'll keep on the theme of Dr. King, as we would say. You went to Boston University at the same time that Dr. King was... He wasn't a doctor then. He was the Rev.
He wasn't even that, I don't think.
What was he? Martin?
He was Martin, and he was a theology student. And the way it worked, Boston University was founded as a Methodist university, as opposed to Boston College, which is Jesuit.
Being Catholic.
Right.
And there's a little pervasive theme in your book about the Catholic or anti-Catholic bias. It's a very interesting little, side note in American history is that I didn't really realize at Kennedy's death that many Americans were celebrating.
Absolutely.
I found that out.
Especially in Van Wert.
Well, yes, and that was more of I would assume, a Protestant area.
Well, if you know your history of this part
of
Ohio...
Well, there's a lot of German Catholics,
The German Catholics came north from Cincinnati.
We thank them for their beer, by the way.
And the Anglo-Saxon Protestants came down from Toledo. And where they met was around Mercer County.
Oh.
Which has both. Which is why there is... a larger number of Catholics in Salina than there are in Van Wert, which is north of that.
So there's a little more Protestants in, I can get off on many subjects, especially...
Van Wert is a sort of Protestant town.
And then Salina is a Catholic town. As I've...
Mixed.
Well, mixed, but is it more Catholic? Anyway, it's an interesting little side note in American history about that particular...
And in Van Wert, on the day that Kennedy was killed, I was the city editor of the paper, the Times Bulletin, and I turned to Carol Murray, who was my sob-sister, and I said, why don't you call the Ministerial Association and get reaction as to what they're going to do in memorial services and so forth. And the first guy she called up was the president of the Ministerial Association. Now, mind you, that's the Protestants. And she hung up, and she was livid. And she turned to me, she said, you know what that misery said? And I said, no. She said, you got the wrong party. You got to call the priest. He's their president.
Yes, and I find that's an interesting little, as you grew up in an idyllic part of America,
Well,
I was not exposed to that. As I said, back to the history. We're more of a...
Well, let me finish with that. That night, the basketball game that had been scheduled by Van Wert High School played. The band played at the basketball game. The flag over the post office flew the next morning at full staff. They were happy he was dead.
So, were there a lot of people that were happy that Dr. King was dead?
That I don't know. I can tell you how I met him and so forth. I came out of the Korean War and I had a little bit of GI Bill coming to me, so I went back to BU for a master's degree. And the GI Bill for the Korean War was not quite as generous as GI Bill had been for the World War II vets. So I ended up having...
It wasn't a war, it was a police action, right?
Well, that's what they called it.
Okay.
I had to go to work after school, and I worked at John Hancock Insurance Company together with a lot of theology students from BU.
What were they doing at the insurance company?
Well, they were trying to eke out a living too, because their conferences that had sent them to BU to get their theological training probably were not providing enough money for these guys to live as they wanted to, and so they went to work. And we didn't earn much, but it was enough to eke out an existence.
So what were you doing for the insurance company? Figuring, ciphering, running around?
No. That was in the days of paper records, and policies were numbered, and we had to constantly go through draw after draw looking for policies that had been lost.
Aha. Much like they're doing today for mortgages that have been lost.
Yeah.
The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Anyhow, two of those theology students became friends of mine. One of them, even after we graduated, his name was George Holland, and he was from Oklahoma, and we called him Okie. And one day Okie said to me, "Why don't you come to lunch over at the refectory and get out of eating in the Commons?" Now, the Commons was a great big huge mess hall in which all of Boston University was eating, and the refectory was a small private dining room in the School of Theology. Food was just about the same, but it was quiet, and you could talk. And so, if I remember correctly, there were 6 of us at a table, and sitting next to me was this black man, and I was introduced, and his name was Martin. And Martin was a Baptist minister.
Aha, my persuasion.
Who, for some reason or other, had come to BU for his doctorate. I don't know the politics behind any of that. Also at our table was a Cypriot Greek who, when he was outside the school, wore a stovepipe hat that was about this high. And at one point, the British had put a £50,000 pound, that's about $250,000, bond, a premium on the capture of Archbishop Makarios, who became the first president of Greek Cyprus. He didn't go to BU, but several of his people did, and every morning I used to see them coming out of his rooming house, which was across the street from my rooming house, and there'd be 6 bodyguards lining the sidewalk, and he would walk through and get into a car and drive 2 blocks to Boston University School of Theology.
Now, what did you have a discussion with Martin?
Oh yeah, every Thursday.
Aha!
And Martin did not like me, and I did not like Martin.
Why?
Well, Martin started off by telling me and the Greek that terrorism of any sort is absolutely unforgivable, and the only way to get along is following the footsteps of Mahatma Gandhi.